Maybe we can move over to Ukraine real quick because you said you wanted to talk about the casualty numbers, which this is always,
Yeah,
something that I've always been wanting to get to the bottom of. So if you can shed some
right.
light, please do.
Okay. Well, yeah, I just found myself thinking about that because I was, I have to acknowledge my debt to the blog events in Ukraine. I found that to be extremely illuminating. Anyway, there was a recent discussion or a blog post there about the current defense minister, Fedorov, and his advisor, Sternenko. And that involves casualty figures. So, we'll just start with them. Fedorov, again, he doesn't have any background in the military. His background is basically kind of marketing and PR stuff. But this is something that's very common at the top levels in the Ukraine government. Again, we have people from entertainment, including, Zelensky. Yermak is former head of the president's office and who's still very, very powerful behind the scenes right there. He was also associated with that same studio. And many of the people in within the governing elite of Ukraine, do come out of entertainment, but also marketing, PR. I think it goes to explain a lot of what Ukraine does. That's what they're best at. They're best at the information war. And you can see it quite clearly in their choice of this defense minister, Fedorov. Right. Again, no military experience, but he's got PR experience. And one of the first things that he said as the new defense minister is that we're going to set this goal. We're going to kill 50,000 Russians a month. Now, he's claiming that they're killing 35,000 a month now, but they're going to raise that to 50,000. I think the 35,000 is absurd. It's nowhere near that. We'll get into that more later. But then he also chose as his advisor this man Sternenko. Now Sternenko is kind of part of the far right community, but somebody who is actually hated by many of the ultranationalists because he has never gone and fought himself. He's constantly cheering, the mobilization efforts and is opposed to ceasefires. You actually find among the real ultranationalists, the ones that are in the trenches, they're in favor of a ceasefire. They want to go back and fight the war another day, but they know they're losing, and they need some time to reconstitute and build up their forces again. But as so many of these people, these information warriors, they're against ceasefires, and that's true of the liberals as well. Anyway, this man Sternenko has quite a colorful past, and back in 2018, he stabbed to death an unarmed veteran and live streamed it. He's now the advisor to the Minister of Defense. Now, why isn't he in prison right now? Well, apparently, that he was facing a prison sentence, but certain Americans, the members of the U.S. elite intervened, because I think they saw him as an asset. So he remained free. And what he's been doing over the last several years is he has this, during the years of the war, he has a Telegram channel and I think another social media platforms where he actually incentivizes Ukrainian drone operators to kill infantry. Each time, whenever they kill a Russian soldier, they get what's called an E-point. And with an E-point, they can buy discounted drones, or their unit can. And so there's an incentive, to actually kill individual infantry. And then what he does is he gets the footage of the kill. You see the poor Russian soldier look up, a look of horror on his face just before he dies. And everybody thinks that's really funny. And they see that, okay, the drone operator gets an E-point, and then his million or so followers in Ukraine, just lap this up and send him funds, and they post their emojis and whatever, this is funny, they like it, whatever, and they send him $10 or the equivalent in Ukrainian currency. And this is what he's been doing. Now, it's been pointed out that this actually, it's first of all just kind of sick, I think. Maybe I'm just very naive. This is what happens in wars, but I find it sick. That you're actually celebrating the individual deaths. We know there's a lot of death in war. The Russians are killing Ukrainian soldiers. Ukrainians are killing Russian soldiers. But then to kind of make a game out of it, it strikes me as rather perverse. But it also doesn't make real strategic sense, as other analysts, like military analysts within Ukraine, have pointed out. The Russians are not doing that. They're not focusing on killing. They actually have an advantage in the drone war, and the Ukrainians admit that now. Up until a year ago, it wasn't true. And then during the first couple of years of the war, the Russians were really at a disadvantage. They weren't ready for drone warfare, and the Ukrainians had a head start on them. But now the Russians are dominant, in drone warfare. But they don't focus on killing infantry. They actually go after vehicles, logistics, to deprive, the front lines of their supplies. And then by doing that, they're able to, again, seize territory. And they can actually, advance. And it's yet another example, I would say, of the information war actually taking precedence over the real war. Again, it's for emojis, it's for donations online. But it's not. It doesn't make strategic sense. It's being driven by this guy with his Telegram channel. Rather than by real strategic interests and by commanders that are just looking at the military realities. But we see this up and down from Zelensky on down. This is Ukraine. This is Ukraine. This is a Ukraine again. At the highest levels, we have actual murderers. We talked about the Strangler earlier. Is now a deputy to the new head of the GUR. Now, okay, since we're just talking about casualties, I was just thinking, it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on. I think we have, for Russian killed in action, the best we have still is MediaZona. MediaZona is now actually starting to publish names. And we'll see, if that holds up. And you say, okay, if there's a problem with that, I'm sure there will be Russians that point it out. But if there isn't, and, it has to be admitted, yes, this person died in combat, then we can know that their figures are solid. And what their figures show is that so far, 160,000 Russians have been killed, which is a lot of Russians. It's an awful lot. Like in the Vietnam War, the U.S., which went on for several years, the U.S. lost 55,000, maybe 60,000, were killed in action. This is it's a new war. It's the Ukrainians and the Russians are fighting, and kind of in the future. The rest of us are in the past and kind of assessing it with past standards. This is drone warfare. It's different. It's very, very bloody, and the kill ratios are very high. Now, one thing we have MediaZona, but now what is happening? What is really the ratio between Ukraine and Russia? And we've had several actual body exchanges. Now, when you talk about prisoner exchanges, those are limited. The thing is, if there are, for each Ukrainian prisoner who is returned by the Russians, the Ukrainians return one Russian. So it's 1-to-1. So you can't tell from that what the ratio is. But with the body exchanges, there's no limit. And over the last year or two, it's been very lopsided. And the most recent one, again, was very, very lopsided. There was a very slight uptick in the number of Russian bodies, but it doesn't affect the ratio at all. And the ratio comes out at over 30-to-1. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that's the actual kill ratio, because the Russians are advancing, the Ukrainians are retreating. So part of it is about the fact that the Russians are taking territory. When they take territory, they find these bodies and they pick them up, right? But we know that the Ukrainians, well, first of all, they counterattack frequently, they did in Kupiansk, and they occasionally do take Russian territory. But it's temporary. But in that time, they do take the territory, and if the attack is successful, they will collect Russian bodies. That's what's going to happen. And on the other hand, is what we're hearing from Ukraine and its Western supporters, all these different analysts. They claim that the Russians are extremely wasteful with lives. They do these human wave assaults, these meat assaults they call them, and again, and eventually just by expending so many bodies, so many lives, they manage to take territory. That's the story that we've been hearing again and again. It's kind of constant. But if that were true, you would see that reflected in the body count, right? You certainly would, because because if most of these attacks, using great numbers of Russians are unsuccessful, they're going to leave a lot of bodies there on the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians are going to hold their ground, or maybe step back and then move forward again and take them. But it doesn't happen. They're just very few. You get 30 Russian bodies to 1,000 Ukrainian ones. So it tells you that it is, the ratio, it is lopsided. I don't know what the exact ratio is, but it's clearly lopsided in favor of the Russians. So if the Russians have lost 160,000, I would guess that, the Ukrainians have lost at least 3 times that many, 6 times that many, very easily could be that. And then again, the other thing that I think you can look at is direct evidence of what the real losses are. It's just, you see how the Ukrainians respond to these forced conscription efforts. And those have been coming out at just an extraordinary rate. I mean, from Ukraine, filmed by Ukrainians themselves. This is not Russian propaganda, but you see it again and again. They, see the man who's being pulled from the bus or from a cafe or from whatever, from his work, from a gym, is fighting back. And then, people around him immediately recognize what's going on. They run over and they try to save him. What does that tell you? It just tells you, but they see it as a death sentence. And if you can find, you won't find anything like that in Russia, first of all, because they don't have forced conscription. And you say, well, okay, they're offering him good financial packages. That's true. These are actually very considerable. A young man looking at that could say that, this really could, with this, I'll have it made. I can come back and I'll be able to put a down payment on a house or whatever, something like that. Or we'll be able to do that in a few years. And, but if there's a high chance you're going to be killed, very high, you're not going to do that. And there's no way that the Russians can hide that from people. Everybody knows, you have friends and cousins and classmates that have gone and they come back and they tell you what it's like, or they don't come back and you say, well, wait a second, I'm not doing that. So, I mean, I think just looking at those 3, we got MediaZona, we have the fact of the body exchanges, and then we have the difference in, conscription. It's forced conscription. It's press gangs on one side, and then it's voluntary and very successful. Even the Ukrainians have admitted, like the Russians are exceeding their targets. They're trying to get 30,000 a month, but more than 35,000 a month are signing up. I think all those things tell you that, no, it's not the Russians that are, suffering these horrendous losses. They're suffering real losses. Again, 160,000, if that's true, and I think it's probably true, is nothing to be sneezed at. But it's everything else tells us that it's the Ukrainians that are suffering, the horrendous losses.
Will we ever know the actual casualty count in Ukraine?
We might, I wish the Russians would just be honest about it.
About their numbers?
About their numbers, yeah. And then I think we might in the end, when the war is over, studies will be done. There will be organizations that go and start going to the seminaries. And, right now, this is a nation at war and in chaos and under military rule. But there may be a time when that's no longer true and that a real accounting can be done.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that because when I looked at my history books and I'd look at these battles, I would see very specific numbers going back, like the Civil War, like, the North lost 110,321 and the South lost 72,800, like an exact precise number. And I was like, okay, well, and then everything we've seen in the past 3 years in Ukraine, with Russia, with Gaza, nobody knows, with the Iranian protesters. It's just all manipulation.
Yeah,
Everybody is just making up numbers and saying that, oh, it's way higher, way lower. Nobody's been killed. It's just,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
insane.
right.
So I don't know if that's just the time that we live in, where we're just in this constant hyper propagandized, manipulated media, or if it's just typical that nobody knows while the war is going on, and we never find out until 10 years after.
Yeah, well, I think it was certainly in the case of the Ukraine war. Yeah, we're gonna have to wait to find the real numbers. But I
I
think we're
think that's
getting a
right.
sense of it. It's just, again, we can look at all these things. One thing I didn't mention too is just that, okay, yeah, the Russians are advancing, and advancing is more dangerous than retreating. The Ukrainians are playing this game of just going after infantry, right? But the fact is the Russians just have much more firepower. They're dominant in drones. They have complete air superiority. They have their fab bombs, which do terrific damage. They don't just kill one person. When they hit a bunker, they might kill, a couple dozen. And which the Ukrainians don't have at all. They have nothing to counter that, right? And then artillery, the Russians still had an advantage. And then another big advantage is with the missiles. Again, it's just like it's nothing. The occasional HIMARS gets through from the Ukrainian side, but we see what the Russians are doing. They're just hitting targets at will across Ukraine, and a lot of those are energy infrastructure, and a lot of them are logistical centers, that kind of thing. But in many cases, they're personnel gatherings too. It's like it's a training camp, or it's a train that's carrying soldiers to the front, that kind of thing. And you have to add that in there. And again, that's all lopsided. That's all in favor of the Russians.